Thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us. And as you heard the last session, HTA and how it's applicable in Africa, there we were talking about how HTA bodies decide what to pay for. Now, the important part is, can now Africa get together and ensure that what gets regulated in Africa is to our required safety and quality standards, and that we all have a Pan-African organization that regulates on our behalf in total transparency and with equity and with that scientific advice. As you know, many of us who grew up in Africa, we had great dreams from President Kwame Nkrumah, who was talking about Pan-African institutions that would bring us together, build our resolutions, help us work together, and put some oil and grease in the tensions we have over our borders, and dams, and currently what's going on, fighting over small territories here and there. I think that Pan-African dream is still alive, and I was so glad to see that the African Union announced the establishment of the African Medicines Agency, and I'm eternally grateful for His Excellency Honorable Michel Sidibé, the Health Minister from Mali, who has single-handedly gone out there and brought 15 African states together to ratify the treaty. All that now we need is for them to submit this treaty and deposit the instruments, and we may have a great agency. But coming up to that agency, we must look at what's important for us. What share of the pie do we get in this? As you know, Africa's patients have long been left out of many decision-making. And this is important for us to understand what African Medicines Agency Treaty and the regulatory convergence and reliance means. We will hear from regulators, Mimi Darko, who will talk about how it is practiced in turn. John Mwangi has been with me for a long time in chasing this from Cape Town way back in 2016, where at the International Council of Drug Regulatory Authorities. Then we moved on to Dublin. And at each stage, Margaret, Numondo, John, and I, we saw gradual victories. But it's been 5 years since 2017 when the treaty was first announced, that we're now finally seeing this, what I call the snow caps of Kilimanjaro on it. The clouds are dispersing and there is hope now. And it's very important. So Mimi Darko is the CEO of an FDA Ghana. She has experience, you can really worked on very interesting regulatory challenges and delivered that task clearly, openly. And that you heard earlier this, during this Congress, when we spoke of fight the fakes, and when there was influx of drugs that were being regulated and looked at. She has risen to that level in Africa that's very rare.
Discussion which will center on medicines regulation in the continent. I'm glad that you're joined today by our able speakers today, who will hear from in Mimi and Johnpaul. But before I get to that, I would like to make a short presentation because I would also like to set the pace as far as what do we want to see for the future of Africa? How do we envision that Africa Medicines Agency will work? And I would like to briefly make a short presentation, and then I can call in our speakers.
John, could I just intervene? We just need to run a little video, and then you start the presentation.
Everyone has the right to effective healthcare and a well-functioning health system. Africa has made great strides in accelerating the major challenge of increasing access to medicines through various public health interventions. However, about half of the population in the poorest places still do not have access to safe, efficacious, and quality medical products. Local pharmaceutical production remains low, with only about 2% of consumed medicines being locally manufactured in Africa. About 25 to 30% of medical products are substandard and falsified, and illicit trade in pharmaceutical drugs remains persistent. This poses a series of threats to public health. Now, more than ever, it's time for change that will ensure African people have quality of life, sound health, and well-being, a priority area in the African Union Agenda 2063. The African Medicines Agency, or AMA Treaty, was endorsed in February 2019 by African heads of state as part of the journey towards an internationally recognized and well-established regulatory authority on the continent. As an organ of the African Union, legally mandated by member states, AMA's goal is to increase the availability of safe and affordable medicines and other health products on the continent. This will be achieved through providing regulatory oversight of selected medical products, as well as promoting regional and national cooperation and harmonization of regulatory decisions. AMA will also support the growth of local pharmaceutical companies, opening up and expanding markets across Africa, which is one of the key objectives of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Working across 55 AU member states, regional economic communities, and regional health organizations, the African Medicines Agency will coordinate and strengthen ongoing regulatory harmonization in the following ways. Firstly, AMA will evaluate medical products for the treatment of priority diseases as determined by the African Union. It will also regularly inspect, coordinate, and share information about products that are authorized for marketing. AMA will coordinate joint reviews of clinical trials applications for vaccines, assessment of highly complex product dossiers such as biosimilars. AMA will also coordinate joint inspections of active pharmaceutical ingredients, API manufacturing sites. By developing common standards and regulations, AMA will also be responsible for harmonizing legislation. For the health and well-being of our people, let us take this further by establishing the African Medicines Agency. AMA must be ratified by at least 15 member states in order for it to come into force. We call on all African governments to ratify the AMA Treaty and endorse the transformation of our continent's pharmaceutical industry and health systems. With this support, the establishment of AMA will reach fruition. Contact the African Union for more information.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. As Kawaldip has gladly indicated, we have a very good opportunity to take stock of what we have been up to for the last, let's say, I would say even more than 5 years in the as far as the regulation of medicines in the continent of Africa is concerned. And today we want to zero in a little bit on the Africa Medicines Agency. As many of you here would know, that there has been a lot of efforts and a lot of activities going on towards strengthening regulatory systems in the continent. And one of them is actually supposed to culminate into the formation of Africa Medicines Agency. Would also like to introduce the concept of Reliance, which I'm going to shortly talk about, because this we find is be integral in the functioning and the proper functioning of Africa Medicines Agency. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So if I may start by introducing what do we mean by regulatory reliance. This is a concept where one of the regulatory agencies, and this is something which is taking place also here in the African continent, decides to take into account and give significant weight to assessment by that have been done by other health authorities around the world. And they tend to use this to make their own decision. It is important to note that as health authorities in Africa, for instance, utilize decisions and assessments that have been made by agencies in other parts of the world, they still have to maintain their independence, as well as remain accountable and responsible for the decisions they have made. On the other hand, this has a benefit to support, faster making of regulatory decisions, which are based on, which are scientifically backed, without necessarily eroding the sovereignty of the countries that are taking these decisions. And we find that this concept has actually and can be used, for instance, in the dossier assessment. Dossier meaning here the documentation that is submitted to the health authority whenever a product has to be evaluated before approval. When we think about how products are manufactured and looking at the GMP aspects, for instance, life cycle management activities, whenever products have been changed, because in the life cycle of the product, variations do occur, and those also have to be evaluated by the health authorities. And what we see is that this is not something that is just for Africa, but it's actually happening across the world. I have shared here a few examples, but zeroing in on what is happening in Africa, I just wanted to share with you the work sharing that we see in Zazibona region, which is one of the regional economic communities that is utilizing Reliance. We will also hear from some of our panelists today about countries like Ghana and the rest who are actually also using Reliance concept. And if I go to the next slide, is what is the advantage of following and having Reliance practices in the country? And we see that whenever authorities and health authorities are using Reliance practices, there is benefit to all the stakeholders. Today we're here because we are talking about the patients here in Africa. And here I can confidently say that if we follow the Reliance practices, and if the health authorities in Africa and the rest of the world for that matter follow Reliance practices and practice them, then we are likely to see timely access to safe and effective and quality medicines to patients. And this is likely to happen because the authorities, for instance, in Africa and other countries don't need to wait for 5 years to be able to make evaluation for products to be available in those countries, but they can actually rely, without losing their independence, on decisions and assessments which have been made elsewhere. If you look at the regulatory agencies, one of the difficulties we find, especially in the African continent, is that we still don't have enough resources to be able to evaluate all the products, especially the new products, which are coming up and required for the patients. And if the regulatory authorities in the African continent, in this case, decide and follow Reliance practices for some of the activities they do, be it dossier review or GMP assessments, so we are also likely to see saving in the resources that they utilize, and them only doing the activities that only them can do, like local post-marketing surveillance, which only the countries themselves can do. Of course, also for the manufacturers, this helps to streamline the management of regulatory submissions, as well as introduce elements of predictability and timely approvals in what is filed at the health authority. And this overall has the benefit, now that today we talk about the patients, to help the patient get the products in a timely manner without any compromise on the quality of the products. And if you go to the next slide, because I would like to link this now with the topic of discussion today about Africa Medicines Agency, is that actually Reliance has to be one of the tools that we use if IFPMA has to be successful. We cannot utilize the same principles we have utilized over the years from the national agencies when we come to IFPMA, because IFPMA is about simplifying things. It is about collaborating. It is about bringing all the stakeholders on board so that the decisions that have been taken elsewhere can be considered when decisions are being made for products to be available for patients in Africa. And we've seen this also during the pandemic, when we saw that countries were relying on the assessments that were coming from some of the other countries that had already evaluated in cases of emergency use authorization for the COVID-19 vaccines. And what a better way to get into AMA, or Africa Medicines Agency, if not through utilization of Reliance practices. Now, to take us to the next set of discussions and to hear practically how does this work, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mimi Darko from Ghana FDA, who will take us through practical examples and what Reliance really means at the level of a health authority in the African continent, as well as regionally, and any global examples that could be shared, and to link this up with what does this then mean for the patients in the African continent. So without taking much more time, I would like to introduce you and welcome you, Mimi Darko, to give us your perspective.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my experience as an African country that has used Reliance. So I'll talk about the approval pathways that are available to a regulatory authority. I'll give an overview of Reliance, but John has done half of my work for me already. And then I'll talk about some of the mechanisms for Reliance that we have both at the global and at the regional level. And then I'll focus on one particular case, and I'll use the African Vaccines Regulatory Forum as the example. Next slide, please. So national regulatory authorities are there to ensure that every product that we register is quality, safe, and efficacious, and then it is also promoted correctly for the benefit of the patient. That is one of the functions of regulatory authorities that people normally are not aware of. And for all the work that we do, we have in place guidances for all our procedures. Now, in order to do a review, a regulatory authority has several pathways available. We can actually do a full review, which means that we'll do the dossiers right from the administrative through all the modules. We can use Reliance, and then we can also use collaborative procedure, which is a new process that is based on well-defined processes. Next slide, please. So John has already told us a bit about Reliance. So I would just point out that the idea of Reliance is that it allows us to not to do a full evaluation, but to do what we call an abridged assessment of products, which means that we better use our resources to, as John said, the way we need them or where we need them the most. But the benefit of Reliance is that you have a timely access to quality, safe, and assured efficacious medicines. It also allows us to be able to evaluate erstwhile complex therapies that for some of us countries, we may not have the expertise to do it. So using Reliance allows you to be able to have those therapies available in your country. It also allows us to prevent duplication of efforts. I mean, there's no regulatory agency that has enough resources anywhere in the world. And for African regulators, sometimes we are even at a lower end. So it allows us to best use our resources where we need them. Next slide, please. So Reliance mechanism at the global level. So we have now, fortunately, we have a lot of mechanisms available to us. We have the Swiss Medic Marketing Authorization for Global Health Products procedure. So that is a collaborative procedure where the regulator can sit with Swiss Medic as they are evaluating a product, and then we take part in it. So the dossier may not necessarily have been submitted to us at the time, but in sitting with them, it is a form of capacity building. We collaborate to make decisions. Once they've made the decision, if that application comes to us again, we don't duplicate the efforts because we had staff who were part of that process. And therefore, we register the product quickly and make it available to our population. WHO has the same mechanism that is used. We also have another mechanism that is where we have access to shared reports. So if, say, the EMA has evaluated a product and that application comes into your country, what you can do is that you have access to the European Medicines Public Assessment Report. If it has been issued, had pre-qualification by WHO as well, if it comes into our countries, we don't duplicate the efforts. We ask for the assessment report, we are given access, and then it allows us to evaluate the products. We also have the WHO public inspection reports. So that is where WHO has done a GMP inspection, a good manufacturing practice inspection, for a particular product manufactured in a particular jurisdiction. If that product comes to your country, you can actually have access to the inspection reports, and therefore you don't have to do a GMP inspection yourself again. And that allows us to approve the product faster and make it available to our population. There's also the WHO and Stringent Regulatory Authority pilot project, of which we are also have the opportunity to join. Next slide, please. Now, if you talk about mechanisms at regional level, fortunately, we've been talking about the African Medicines Agency, and we are all working towards that. We have not had 15 countries ratify the treaty yet, but we have the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization. And so far, all the regional economic communities are part of it. So you have the East African Community, which has 6 countries and a large population of over 115 million. You have the ECOWAS or WAHO, which has 15 countries and 185 million people. So we have Zazibona, we have SADC. And then you realize that with this harmonization, this African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, I will show you the structure probably in the next slide. It allows us to work as regional and economic blocks, and for these blocks to also come together to make sure that by the time we have the African Medicines Agency, we are ready to feed into the African Medicines Agency through this Medicines Regulatory Harmonization project. And therefore, we would now all be working together to evaluate products together. We also have the African Vaccines Regulatory Forum that has been in existence since, I think, 2006. And that was set up specifically to ensure that vaccines primarily and clinical trials of vaccines were done faster, especially where it was a neglected tropical disease or it was in a pandemic. Access to pipeline products would be very fast because clinical trials could be approved through joint reviews by several countries in Africa at the same time. AVREF has also gone ahead to even make available products through registration, through joint registration. And AVREF is now the technical working group for clinical trials within the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, which eventually becomes will feed into the Africa Medicines Agency. Next slide, please. So I'll now talk about AVREF, using AVREF as a form of a Reliance initiative that allows us to have products faster in the individual African countries. Next slide, please. So the objective of the AVREF, when it first started in 2006, was that it was set up as an informal capacity building platforms. And the good thing about AVREF is that it has both the regulatory authorities, which are the NRAs, and ethics. And these are the two bodies that are responsible for granting approval for a clinical trial or granting authorization. It allowed us to, the objective was also to improve regulatory oversight of interventional clinical trials that are conducted in Africa. Now, was AVREF a success? I would say yes, because from 2006 to date, it has strengthened regulatory capacity and ethics review oversight of all clinical trials. It has also allowed us to promote, to harmonize our standards and approaches. Now, one of the difficulties is that if you try to do anything in any individual countries, every country has their own standards, every country has their own guidelines. And even if you are doing a joint, in those days, doing a joint, a multi-center clinical trial, by the time you had got approval from one country, there would be another challenge in another country. So what AVREF allowed us to do was to harmonize our standards, harmonize our guidelines, and we now all use common guidelines and standards and approaches to clinical trials, both with the NRAs, which are the regulatory authorities, and the ethics. It led to an accelerated review of vaccines which were of public health value. So in pandemics, for neglected tropical diseases, vaccines were approved faster. And we've now even extended AVREF to medicines. And you'll see that in my next few slides. Thank you. Next slide, please. So talking about the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, this is actually the governance structure. And you see in red, AVREF, we have continental working groups, and AVREF is the clinical trials and oversight working group. You can see we have market surveillance, we have blood and blood products, we have regulatory systems, we have good manufacturing practices, and we have vigilance. So all of them feed into the harmonization, and that is the way we are going to look at Africa Medicines Agency when we work. We'll have these working groups within which we'll be working. And each working group is made up of all the different countries where the expertise is. So if you are not in one working group as a country, you will definitely be in another working group. And the idea is that these groups work fast, and once you go back to your individual countries, you are stand a better chance of approving the product or the trial, or sharing data on GMP inspections a lot quicker. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of, I talked about how we harmonized our documents within AVREF. And what we did is, once we had a document, so for example, if we had a document on inspections, what we did was we went, as part of the AMRH framework, we went to all the countries. So each of the regional economic blocks was presented with the document that had been developed by AVREF. So if it was a document for evaluating the clinical part of a dossier, if it was looking at the authorization guideline for clinical trials, we visited, there was a workshop in each and every regional economic block in one of the countries, and all the countries came together, and the guidelines were what you call domesticated, which allowed them to now adopt them, put them on their websites and use them. So for every guideline that was developed, it was domesticated in each and every one of the regional economic blocks. So this is just a photo showing one of such, which was done in the West Africa region in 2019. Next slide, please. So what is the benefit of reliance to patients in Africa? So I'll give an example in pandemics. So in 2015-16, when we had Ebola, what happened was that the countries worked together to ensure a vaccine was available. And I remember we were part of a joint review for the GSK vaccine, the J&J vaccine at the time, and then the Merck Ebola vaccine. So we worked together to approve the clinical trials in some of the countries where the trials took place. There was a joint review. So there was not a situation where ethics would review in one country and then come to regulatory before there was an approval. We all came together, did a joint review to ensure that there would be a vaccine available. And now we have the Merck Avibo, which is the Merck Ebola vaccine, which was used is now fully registered in several African countries as a result of that joint review. And we actually did a joint review for the registration. So Ghana has registered it. A lot of countries have registered it, and it's even registered in the EU and the USA. And we did that through Reliance. Once we had done the process together, we all went back to our countries, relied on the information that we had done in the joint review, and registered them. And that was how come the vaccine was available for the 2019 and 2020 outbreaks. Now, coming down to COVID, Reliance was used for emergency use authorization of vaccines for most of us countries. So WHO did an emergency use listing, and then countries would take the reports from WHO, and then based on that, we would also give an emergency use authorization. And that is the Reliance at its best, especially in a pandemic. And that is how come we registered vaccines like Moderna, the AstraZeneca vaccine, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, etc. And some of these vaccines that were approved through Reliance are being distributed under the COVAX scheme at the moment in a lot of African countries. Next slide, please. If you look at epidemics, taking meningitis, which is where we have seasonal outbreaks in most African countries in the meningitis belt. Now, there was a vaccine called Meningococcal A vaccine, which is Menafric A, which was developed to deal with the outbreak in 2011. Now, Menafric Vac obtained accelerated review and approval in several African countries using the AVREF joint review mechanism. So a few countries came together, did the review in a joint review, and then individual countries gave authorization relying on that joint review that was done. And that inspired hope for the future without meningitis. And in the last outbreak, as I said earlier, it was this vaccine that was used to combat the outbreak. So you can see Reliance during epidemics and how Reliance has been used to make products available during epidemics. Next slide, please. Now back to where diseases that are endemic, and Reliance has also worked. So there was a GSK Mosquirix malaria vaccine. And with that vaccine, there was also a joint review with AVRF, where a few of us countries came together, and under the AVRF framework, we did a joint review, and then we had timelines. So for each joint review, there are very short timelines within which, once the joint review has been done and a recommendation has been made, you go back to your individual countries and then you give approval. So the same thing happened with the malaria vaccine. And currently the vaccine has been registered in Ghana, Kenya, and Malawi. I think some other countries have registered it. And we are doing a pilot implementation. So we've rolled it out on a pilot basis to look at the effectiveness, further safety studies. And we're expecting a recommendation from WHO in 2022 based on the implementation that is taking place in these 3 countries. Now, this was collaborative work by African regulators who sped up the assessment by coming together, doing the evaluation, and then making the vaccine available for the benefit of patients. Otherwise, it would have taken much longer to go to each country, where each country would now be doing the review. Next slide, please. Now, it is not just in clinical trials or in registration or marketing authorization where we have come together to use the Reliance mechanism. We've actually now started using it even in safety monitoring. And the African Union has led a program called the AU Smart Safety Surveillance Program. And it is a continental initiative that pulls together safety data to allow early detection of safety signals. So if you know anything about, in pharmacovigilance, we say getting a signal is like finding a needle in a haystack. And so if a country is using a product, and we've actually piloted this with COVID, the COVID-19 vaccines. And if Ghana had to look at its own database for COVID adverse events or any signals, it would take forever. And so what we've done is that we've piloted it with 3 countries, which is actually 4 countries, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And we are putting all our safety data into one common database, which is under the AU3S program. And what is going to happen is that it improves medicines and vaccine safety for patients, because if there's any safety signal, the signal is picked up much quickly. We are the same, much quicker. We're the same population. We are looking into one database. It allows for signals to be generated quicker because there's more data coming into the database. The data would be mined, and if there are any challenges, we pick them up quicker. It also allows increased confidence in the product, because if there are any safety concerns, we will pick them up quickly. We communicate these safety concerns as well to our population. We let them know that, yes, you are seeing this, but in our pool database, it is the same happening in, say, Nigeria, it is the same happening in South Africa. And therefore you allow your community or your patients to be confident that you are looking out for the products that they are using. And if there's if there's a problem or a signal, you will let them know in time. And we've realized that it has built a lot of confidence even among the countries. And we are relying on other countries' safety data. So Reliance can actually also be used in product safety monitoring. And this has allowed us to work together and share data among the member states. So at the end of it, this is an initial pilot, but subsequently, all the African countries will be feeding into this same database and picking up safety signals from the same database, which I think is actually very excellent for Africa and for our patients, because product safety is patient-related. And we are also using a particular app which allows the patient to have access to his safety data, to be able to report quickly just through an app. And it is a patient-focused safety program. That's why we call it the Smart Safety Surveillance. You have your safety in your hand. That's what we call the app. And it's called the Safety Surveillance app that we're using. Next slide, please. So to conclude, regulatory reliance provides benefits to African patients by first allowing them timely access, or accelerated access to products for pandemics, for epidemics, and for diseases which are endemic. and other mechanisms made access easier to vaccines and medical products, especially during the this coronavirus pandemic. And collaboration or collaborative working is also improving Africa's capacity to be able to identify safety signals in relation to medical products, thereby protecting Africa patients. And on this note, I'd like to say a big thank you to the organizers for having me, and just to let them, the organizers know that regulators are currently thinking about patients, and Reliance is one way where we can serve our patients better. Thank you very much.
Good conclusion that regulators are thinking about patients, and Reliance is at the center of what the regulators would like to do. And thank you for that well-detailed presentation showing all the activities that are happening at the global level, as well as regional level, and the examples you shared with us about AVAREF. Also the benefits that come with following Reliance. It is also good to hear that this is also a benefit that the regulators in the continent actually acknowledge. Thank you for that. And we will be having a few questions after the next presenter. I can see already a few of them are coming through. Thank you for already explaining some of the concepts, and we can take a few minutes afterwards to answer some of the questions. For the time being, I would also like to invite our audience to share any question they may have on the chat. We will be able to address those questions afterwards. At this point in time, I would like to invite the next speaker, Johnpaul Omollo, who is coming from Perth, to give us a short overview of Perth organization advocacy approaches in the ratification of IFPMA treaty, as well as the work that they have done and the importance of strong regulatory systems and advocacy in the continent. So the floor is yours, Johnpaul.
Thank you once again, Manish and John Mwangi, for that introduction. And, when I was looking at this session and asking myself, what kind of audience are we going to have today, and what would be the best value addition for such an audience? So I took this approach of talking about Africa Medicines Agency and the need for regulatory harmonization from the very basics part of it. And then we are going also to look at how can we add value? What can be our contribution into, the regulatory harmonization and Africa Medicines Agency being at the center of it from the advocacy point of view. Next slide. So just a quick one is that I wanted to speak about Perth being, we are a global organization. We are more geared around health equity. And the way we do our work is by ensuring we partner with, we strengthen our partnership with other entities, both public and private. And we do that to scale up innovations. We scale up solutions within the health sector with a focus on, the most marginalized population within especially lower middle income countries. Next slide. So, next slide. Thank you. So as a way, and some of these has come, the previous slide, some of the challenges have been mentioned by the previous speakers, John and Mimi Darko on this. But I wanted just to raise three key things in this slide that drive us towards the harmonization. Why do we think harmonization is very important for Africa, especially at this point? Number one has been mentioned enough times. There is a number of weak or non-existent medical regulatory systems. And as such, you find that there are certain countries that are doing well. There are certain countries that are still lagging behind. But until and unless all of us are almost at the same level, then because of our porous borders and so, we are all vulnerable. The second thing that I wanted to raise is the issue of, the last one being that there are issues of researchers and manufacturers filling in duplicative dossiers, which have been mentioned again and again. And I think with the harmonization, we will constantly reduce the time it takes to regulate a product or to review a product to the point it gets into the market. And we're going to see how does this affect a patient at the household level. How does it affect you both from the monetary point of view and access point of view? Because that has a great effect. And at the end of it, it can either mean death or being alive. Just by the time it takes a product to reach you, it might mean a lot from a patient point of view. Next slide. So talking about IFPMA and what IFPMA would mean, there are certain things that come into mind. Go to next slide. That come to mind as we're thinking about the African Medicines Agency. And some of the key things that I wanted to raise here is that Africa Medicines Agency, and we are very happy that as we speak right now, we are at the Eureka point of view, where 15 countries have ratified IFPMA, and we give thanks, as Kawaldip had mentioned, to the Africa Special Envoy, His Excellency Michel Sidibe, and of course all other partners and agencies that really championed and advocated for the ratification, for countries to ratify IFPMA. We are only 15 members strong. We have 40 member countries to pull into this. So we still have a huge task ahead to talk to all the other 40 member countries to ratify IFPMA, because that is where where our vision and our ambition is. So just a quick snapshot, how would this IFPMA, how is it going really to help us as a continent? Some of the key things that come into mind, apart from, ensuring that we put out of the market any substandard and falsified products into the market, is, the issue of accessing and regulating complex or specialized medical products. And most importantly, again, is the fact that it's also going to promote local production. We all know the talk around generic products and how that issue of availability of generics would make availability and access to certain products that are currently not accessible, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and that will make it possible that we access these products. Next slide. Some of the value additions that I wanted to raise, apart from what is appearing in bullet 1, 2, and 3, being the ease, and bullet 3 being ease of flow of business, and this would be would be music to the ear of African leaders. We do know that in Africa, we are still struggling to, have our products be meet the GMP standards and be able to export, products that are manufactured within Africa to outside Africa within our geography. So IFPMA is going to ease in that flow of business and make it important, or make it very necessary, that we can easily export products outside Africa, and that is revenue for this country. I wanted to dwell more again because we are talking about patient and patient access. Number 6 talks about, improving the access to essential medicines and health technologies that are safe, effective, affordable, and that meet those international standards. We are struggling, and previous slide, the previous presenter mentioned that about 25 to 30% of all products that are circulating in Africa are either substandard or falsified. But we know the cost of that. It means longer times being sick. It means, even getting catastrophic because of, or diseases transgressing or getting worse because of taking the wrong medications. And that has an implication at the point of a patient, at the point of at the household point of view. Next slide. So why do we think that, this is still important to patient? I drew this out of the bigger picture because I knew we were going to talk to, patient group, patient organizations. Number one, and these are some of the advocacy things that we can talk about as we're thinking about the value addition, not only for even IFPMA, but also for regulatory harmonization. Number one is that we will be accessing latest innovations in the market. We do know that Africa has been lagging behind in terms of the innovations or products that we are using. There are certain diseases, especially the rare diseases, that we are using technologies that were used 20, 30 years behind. But with IFPMA and with stronger regulatory harmonization, stronger regulatory systems in Africa, we will be seeing newer advanced innovations on medical products into the market. Secondly is the issue of safety that has been talked about over and over, and being that we are going to accelerate access to those medical products. And lastly is the issue of the cost. We do know that the longer a product takes during the regulatory process or during the assessment process, there's a cost implication. And the person who is going to pay that cost is usually the patient themselves. So the earlier we shorten, the time it takes to regulate or the time it takes to assess products, the lower the cost it will take, because we do know, and then we do know that again, the fact that as we speak, with the current architecture that is happening, where pharmaceutical industries or farms have to go through different regulatory systems, on all these systems or all these authorities have a fee that needs to be paid. At the end of it, all these costs are usually lumped to the patient themselves. So with the reduction of all these bureaucratic processes, the steps at different countries, we foresee that product cost, which is a big driver to the cost of care. When you talk about universal health coverage and reducing the catastrophic expenditure and out-of-pocket expenditures to the patient themselves, regulatory harmonization is going to be a huge addition towards achieving the cost of care to a minimal value. Next slide. So when we're talking about how are we all going to champion this, advocacy is a key thing that we all need to play towards strengthening regulatory systems for countries, and most importantly for the Africa Medicines Agency. I've mentioned that we have 40 countries that are yet to ratify IFPMA, and we need to be very deliberate on what is it that we want and inform our decision makers what is the value for regulatory harmonization, some of which have been mentioned during this time. And we need to build very strong evidence. And I need to pause here and mention that there are quite a number of evidence that have been generated out there. PATH has developed evidence on looking at what does it take to introduce a product 1 year earlier and 2 years earlier. And we realized that by introducing, we modeled around 2 products, that's the heat stable capetosin and amoxicillin, the amoxicillin tablets. And we realized that just by introducing the products 2 years earlier, we would be saving or averting about 22,000 lives. That is in within a country in East Africa and another country in South Africa, or in the Southern African part. And that is the effect of introducing a product earlier. So such kind of evidence still needs to happen. Currently, we've started a process where we are looking at what is the value addition of ratifying IFPMA for Africa, both from the health and the economic point of view. And this kind of studies needs to be taken into consideration as we engage our decision makers, because at the end of the day, most of these regulatory processes are either legislative processes or some of them require presidential declaration. So these are political bodies that might not really understand why the process is important. But if we are able to, ascertain from using evidence and inform them why, from the health or an economic point of view, why these are really important aspects of the country, then they would be able to understand. Next slide. PATH uses a stent-part approach, and these are working very fast because this takes about 3 to 4 days to train. But we start from the understanding the advocacy issue. As we've said, why is harmonization an important thing? Why is IFPMA important for Africa? And we go all the way to generating the evidence, coming up with the advocacy tactics, then developing the messages for the different audiences that we are looking at, and finally we measure the plan for success. Are we making the right? Is it making value? Are we impacting the lives as we thought we would? And then we make any changes that needs to be made. Next slide. In this slide, I wanted to talk to, how can we play our role from the different countries that we are in Africa or outside Africa? And what could be some of the key messages that we can start talking to our decision maker, our political leaders, to ratify IFPMA or even to strengthen the regulatory systems? One of the key things, one of the key messages is we could, highlight the impact of substandard and falsified medicines. And there are quite a number of studies that really look at it from the African context. How much are we losing from the economic point of view? And some of them have looked at, antibiotics. Some of them have looked at antimalarials and seen it from the economic side, and also some studies have looked at it from the health point of view. How many lives are we losing just by consuming the substandard and falsified medicine? And this can be a huge argument as we're talking to decision makers towards strengthening the regulatory systems at country level, and subsequently aligning to and ratifying IFPMA. The other thing is, engaging our decision makers around the price a country is paying by not, relying on the current technologies, or why if we, continue relying on older technologies, then we might be, losing more from economic, from health sides of view. I won't go into every other aspects, but I wanted to talk about, the fifth item around educating our decision makers about the linkage between regulatory efficiencies and universal health coverage. African countries have really talked about, the need of not leaving anyone behind and reducing out-of-pocket expenditure. But the question we never ask is, what are the key drivers to the cost of care? And as we were developing the essential benefits package for Kenya, where I was a member of the essential benefits package, one of the key things that we realized is the cost of care is not the doctor's fee. It is the cost of medicine, which most people would not be able to get. So if we are able to make the cost of medicine lower as it is, or less than half as it is, then more people will be able to access that product as it is. And of course, we will be having more productive citizens within the African context, as opposed to what we are currently having. As we are even thinking about the rare diseases, and I think the whole day people have been talking about rare diseases and neglected diseases, or some of those diseases that are really hard to cure. But we know that we have the products, we might be having even the technologies, but to access that technology or the product, you need the money. And that money has a cost implication at the household level, because as long as we are one disease away from poverty because of any disease, then you find that we will not be able to access that product. So these are some of the things, or some of the messages that we can use as advocates, as patient groups, to engage our decision makers to ratify IFPMA, or as well to strengthen country-specific regulatory systems and structures. Next slide. I think that was going to be my last slide. And thank you so much, and back to you, John Mwangi.
Thank you, John, for the role of what the patient can actually do. The need to educate, the need to provide evidence-based advocacy, which your organization is currently doing, as well as you have also indicated to us some of the benefits of IFPMA. I would like to go into the next stage and share some of the questions that are coming through from online channels. And one of the questions, I'll start with you, John, before I go to Mimi. The fact that now we have 15 countries, and I have seen that mostly from one region in the continent. Of course, this is important for the legal part of having the treaty ratified, but what happens to the rest of the countries, 40 of or close to 40 of them? Because if we are to go through this journey of IFPMA, I think it is important that then we carry as many of the countries with us.
Hello?
Yeah, yes. I will take over, John. I think you may have a power issue. Is that correct?
Yes, I had a power issue. I think it's now back.
Okay.
Hello? I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good. Yes. So my question to John Patrick, to Johnpaul, is what is it that we need to do for the other 15? Close to 40 countries. And the other, that's one of the question to you, Johnpaul, and you can quickly answer that. And then I'll go to some of the questions that I have here for Mimi.
Thank you, John, and that's a very good question. And it points out on why do we need advocacy? I think I would even reframe it that way. What is the central point of advocacy right now? You know, the 15 country was just the starting point for IFPMA ratification. It gives power to the African Union Commission to, ensure that now the systems and structures for IFPMA start being put in place. But the thing is, even though we are at 15, we need to have all the 45 member countries in place. So as we speak, Perth is currently engaging, countries like Kenya and South Africa to ratify IFPMA. And I would call upon all of us in this room to engage our individual countries through their either legislative or the presidential declaration, so that we can have all the 55 countries ratify IFPMA. We have seen the value addition that IFPMA is coming to bring to us. And especially at this time that we are talking about reliance, we're talking about the need for oneness. I know in Africa, divide and rule has been part of it. And the other day you had, the Director General saying that, self-interest is something that is inherent somehow, but we must outgrow the self-interest that have drawn Africa for so long. Until and unless we are able to look at the economies of scale, we are able to work as one entity in Africa and look at things from the oneness, then we will continuously, be behind the queue. We know what happened with the COVID-19 vaccines. If we did not put in the principles of reliance, I can tell you right now, we would not be having any single country, injecting or providing the vaccines. But because of the principles of reliance and the capacities that have been built on, among our national regulatory authorities, we have seen the speed at which Africa was able. The first country, I think, was Egypt, or was it Egypt? Yes, or something, to be able to start vaccinating quite, I think, 2 or 3 weeks earlier, 2 or 3 weeks after, some of the very first developed countries had started vaccinating. So we need all our African countries to be part of this, train that is moving. So we have a function as all of us to advocate and engage our countries to ratify IFPMA. That would be my call.
Thank you, John. For you, Mimi, I have 2 questions or 3, and I would like to, list all of them together. One of the questions that comes through is, will there be a new pathway to regulate new COVID treatments and vaccines? The other question is, what are regulators doing about fake drugs? And this is, I think, coming from Fight the Fakes Africa chapter. And the third one, more from me, is a lot of the Reliance discussions are centered around new drug application, what we call marketing authorization here. There's a little bit of it in the GMP as well as in pharmacovigilance, but we're still not hearing a lot of it among many countries when it comes to post-approval changes. What would be your view as a regulator in terms of the value for Reliance in handling of post-approval changes? And the final one, the fourth one, is about, and again, this is also from me, it's a question about seeing all the benefits that we are talking about Reliance. And if you look on the other side, it's not like every other country has really taken up Reliance practices. You know, in various measures, some countries still don't have any guidelines which refer to Reliance. What could be those barriers that you see as a regulator, and what could be done to increase the speed of Reliance uptake in the continent?
Wow. That is a very big basket, full of questions. So if I will start, we as regulators, we already have identified 3 pathways. The first is when the regulator does the entire application. The second is if it is that the application has been reviewed by either WHO or what we used to call a stringent regulatory authority, but now in Africa, we are becoming stringent ourselves. And the third, and with that, you rely on the data. The third is when it is that it has not been approved by WHO, it has not been approved by any stringent regulatory authority, what do you do? And those are the 3 that really are available to us at the moment. And the 3 are working quite well. Now, if you take even a situation where we have to do the review ourselves, that means that nobody else has done it, you can actually use a mechanism like the AVREF mechanism, where we have expertise within Africa. We can come together and review it. And that is what AMA does. AMA pulls experts from the individual countries. You have experts in clinical, you have experts, etc. And we will come together and review the application. And then other countries can then take that review, take the reports from us in Africa and do the evaluation. We also have mechanisms where certain countries have, even at the moment, have recognition. For example, with Ghana, we have a recognition arrangement between ourselves, the Gambia, and Sierra Leone and Liberia, for example. So if something is registered in Ghana and we have reviewed it, they also rely on the reports. I mean, those are, as regulators, those are the main pathways that are available. You do Reliance, you do it yourself, and in doing it yourself, you can come together and get the support to do it. Or then you have to do it collaboratively with another agency. I don't think there's going to be any other pathway that is going to come up. I mean, we have enough pathways as this, and all of them together, each and every one of them will help us to get to that point quicker. So that would be my response. What are regulators doing to fight fake drugs? Now that is a big challenge for all regulators. Most of us in Africa have porous borders, and therefore things come through, from one country to another country, and you're not even aware it is in your country. But what we realized as part of the Africa Medicines Regulatory Harmonization was that if we use common documents to review, you are not going to get a situation where somebody is going to make an application in one country and it is going to go very quickly because they are using less stringent mechanisms. We are all going to be using the same. We've also looked at doing projects that allow us to do market surveillance together. So we decide that we are looking at anti-malarials. Now, if Ghana sits here and says, I'm doing an anti-malarial survey, and I do it today, I finish it today, by tomorrow there could be another anti-malarial which will come from another country. So we are also even doing joint joint market surveillance projects together. That means that by the time all the countries that border Ghana have done it, we are sure that we have caught the counterfeits. There are counterfeits in every country. There are counterfeits in developed countries, and it is as it is. But if we believe that if we come together and we are speaking to each other, and I mean, we now have a forum for all heads of agencies as one, where we meet every 2 months. And even within the regional economic blocks, we are speaking to each other we meet every 6 months as Africa as part of AMR Reach. And then as regional economic blocks, we are speaking to each other every 2 months. So that has to continue. The conversation, the communication has to continue. That is the only way that we will be able to have our counterfeits. And in speaking to each other, we alert each other if you've seen something in your country, we could end up in another country. You talked about post-approval changes. We believe that once it has been approved, if there are any changes, we think that it should come through the same mechanism. It is just going to be faster. And if it is a change that has to borders on safety, obviously it's going to be done. We would have the common safety database. We would look through our database to see whether we've seen anything like that. But if you are not careful and we do not communicate, there can be a change that can be reported to, say, Nigeria, but Ghana does not know. So we think that in the same vein as the authorization is done, using joint mechanisms, etc., the proposed approval changes should be done and should be filed in the same way so that that change is available to all the countries at the same time, not just unless it is a change that is peculiar to a specific administrative requirement in one country. Otherwise, it should be done together. We talked also about, I think I've talked about Reliance for market surveillance. And I know in the Northern Africa, there was a study that was so excellent. And West Africa is looking at doing the same study as I talked about, where we all look at a certain number of products at the same time. And therefore, we are able to detect anything that is happening within our countries at the same time. I'm not sure whether what are regulators doing to fight fake drugs? I think I've talked about that. It is a challenge. We've been looking at holograms, but the counterfeiter is always faster than the manufacturer. So we say that if we are speaking to each other and I see something on my market, there's a mechanism in place to report to another market, and then you pick it up. So that is what I can say for the time being. I hope I've answered all the questions.
Thank you, Mimi, for that. In the interest of time, I would like to then hand over now to Kawaldip to make some remarks as well, and also take us from there.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, everybody who is joining us. I think, as we said, this is the African Medicines Agency and Regulatory Reliance is one big elephant, and you walked us around it, so we understand what it is. So we know where it starts, where it finishes, and we know what its components are and how we can work with it. And more importantly, I think now it's a time of making sure that this elephant works for us. I think, as you say, ratification of a treaty is just a start of something, but that a treaty has to be operationalized. And I'm so lucky here sitting in the UK that I first saw the operationalizing of the European Medicines Agency. I remember they were finding offices, and they found offices at Canary Wharf. They had to find staff. They had to find an agency to help the staff migrate and move into those offices. Then had to set up systems. You had to find servers. You had to do all these things were needed to ensure that we actually had safe and secure operational systems. You had reliable access, and the reason why they chose Canary Wharf was it had two great airports serving it. The first one was that small little city airport, which is next door. It only took 15 minutes from the agency to that airport, and you could be anywhere in Europe. In fact, in Brussels, it was a 30-minute flight. Yeah, so they placed that very squarely in that, and now it's moved into Amsterdam. Same story there. That Schiphol is the largest airport, and so we had Heathrow and London City Airport serving it. We have to look for similar situations in Africa. There were rail links. Canary Wharf was served by the Eurotunnel, very excellent. So we have to look at those. But then the most important piece is that I can talk about Natalie Baer as if she's a close friend of ours. Entebbe was appointed as a main liaison officer for patient engagement, and she's done a great job at EMA. She formalized much of the framework and brought that into operation. And it was very important that we do take into that consideration and have them in. And we now would like to discuss the more important part that we had set up the Africa Medicines Agency Treaty Alliance. This alliance was in the same framework as the WHO's Framework Convention Alliance. The role of this alliance is to firstly ensure that all those 15 ratification instruments actually deposited, so we do have a treaty that's enforceable. Then to ensure that this enforced, the remaining members who haven't signed or ratified yet, they do come in quickly. So we have a unanimous ratification of this as a goal, and ensure the commitment is enshrined to safe, quality, accessible, efficacious medicines that we have heard of. Also, we would like to see that within this new agency, we get that formalized, institutionalized framework for patient engagement in the regulatory process and the other stakeholders. That's very important. And what we will be doing is that after this discussion, we will be sending out a call to action that you can discuss amongst yourself and your board members. I know many of you can't sign on to this call to action straight away. You do have to refer it back to your board. I will be sending this out, and it's an easy call to action. In 2017, 5 years ago, we called for and we issued what is called the Entebbe statement. Do look at it. We were sitting there by the shores of Lake Victoria in Entebbe, Uganda, and we had asked for just 3 things. One was to ratify the treaty. Number 2 was to ensure that the treaty was implemented properly. And the third element was to ensure that patients were engaged. We are going to go back to that ratification 3 call to action, nothing more, nothing less, and ensure that we have engagement. And last but not least, we have to ensure that we do get into the more important issues, that once the treaty gets enrolled, we engage in all aspects of its operations and make sure we are there and have that patient-centric view on that. And let's have a great Pan-African organization we can all nurture. It's very rare you get such an organization delivered to you in such a fashion that we can all help grow and make it a beacon of hope for all of us during this pandemic. I will now end this session.